So, Jonathan, always a pleasure to speak to you. I'm a bit upset by how the peace deal is going. I want to rejoice. I want to be happy about it. I know when we spoke first time after the deal, we both were skeptical for different reasons, some similar reasons. But I'm just not happy, and my criticism goes to both sides. In our discussion, I'm going to focus on a few things on the Israeli side. I'll get your thoughts on them. The deal included 600 trucks per day of aid for the population. Now, I think we all agree the civilians there were the ones to suffer the most. And as part of the deal as well, Hamas has to return all the dead hostages to Israel. They've returned all the living hostages in time. It was done pretty quickly. And they've started returning the bodies of the dead hostages. But the agreement does allow them more time in case it takes longer than one would like, longer than 72 hours. And even the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, said the same thing, that it will be difficult to retrieve those bodies. Now, what happened once that was delayed is that Israel halved the aid entering the region. Would love to get your thoughts on this, and if there's another side to that argument.
Yeah, there's always two sides to a coin. And what I would propose is this. When the deal was being made and when the wordsmiths were chiseling the words in order to make it as ambiguous as necessary to allow enough leeway and wiggle room for the deal to actually be implemented. As you say correctly, it says 72 hours for live and dead hostages, and it leaves some wiggle room for other necessities if there are challenges for Hamas to find all of the bodies of the murdered hostages. Now, the issue is this. Before or during the deal, the negotiations, it was clear and understood based on Israeli intel, based on what the Qataris and Egyptians also knew, based on what they had spoken with Hamas, that the number of murdered Israelis that Hamas doesn't have hands on and isn't in direct control and whereabouts of their location is a single-digit amount of Israelis and not higher than 8. That was the understanding shared amongst everybody. Now, when Hamas did what everybody anticipated that they would do, to delay and stall and obfuscate, because they don't want phase 1 to end, they want phase 1 to be extended, because they want more time to settle scores in Gaza. They're trying to buy time in order to reestablish their control over parts of Gaza that the IDF has retreated from. And they just don't want to let down their weapons and actually implement the deal. And they understand that it's one stage after the other. Phase 2 will not start before phase 1 is completed. Israel will not withdraw from the yellow line to the purple, I think it is, or the green line, or whatever the next color is. It will not happen. And the other things that are supposed to happen will not happen before phase 1 is completed successfully. And that means all of the hostages, including the ones that Hamas murdered in captivity. And what Hamas is doing is dishonestly making it look as if the problem with the amount of hostages bodies that they cannot find is bigger than it is in reality. And the fact that they returned only 4 out of 28 is a travesty. That's a direct, it's a spit in the face, it's a slap, it's an insult. And it's basically Hamas testing the waters and saying, okay, let's see what I can get away with. Let's see how soft the Israelis are. Let's see how much pull I'll have with the Qataris, Egyptians, and Turks. And let's see if President Trump has lost interest already and if I can get away with obfuscating the situation. And that's where we find ourselves now. The tools that Israel has, the different things that Israel could do in response in order to show that this isn't okay with Israel, Israel could do a few things. One would be to close the Rafah gate and say, forget about it, we're not opening it until all of the hostages are home, and call me back when you're done stalling. That's one. Two, as you mentioned, limit the amount of trucks coming in. Three, a little bit more escalatory and perhaps a little bit more creative would be to send a bunch of special forces, Israeli special forces, to pick up groceries in Judea and Samaria, and to pick up a lot of the terrorists that were released part of the deal from Israeli prisons. And the Israeli message could be, if you are going to play games with releasing people, two can play that game and we can do it as well. Israel hasn't done that. And of course, more escalatory from Israel's perspective would be to actually change positions on the ground and say, Hamas, if you think that you're going to execute Palestinians on the ground and you're going to cleanse the Dugmush clan, Hamula, and if you're going to make all kinds of wild allegations of collaborations with Israel and you're going to execute people on the ground, as Hamas has been doing in Khan Yunis and in Gaza City, well, we're not going to agree to that, and we'll move 2 or 3 battalions of tanks forward, and you're not going to be doing that anymore. Those are all options are on the table, and what Israel chose was the least escalatory and the softest response that Israel could do in order to indicate that, no, this isn't something that is agreeable. You, Hamas, are supposed to return 28 bodies of murdered Israelis. You returned 4. That's an insult. We know that you have many more in your possession, and the fact that you're not doing it is because you're stalling for time, and we're not going to allow it to happen. And I think with this I will conclude, and I think President Trump's tweet was plain language, Middle Eastern dialect. All of the bodies, all of the live hostages, and it happens now. Stop playing games. And I think that's clear enough, and I hope that Hamas will listen.
So are you saying that if Hamas cannot retrieve all the bodies, and it wouldn't be surprising the International Committee of the Red Cross said it is a massive challenge, finding the dead is even harder than freeing the living. Would you do what Ben-Gvir, or I think it's Ben-Gvir that said that the peace plan is over? He gave him a clear ultimatum. If not all the dead hostages are returned? No. With all respect to him, he's an elected minister. That's fine. But I don't think that his policy recommendations are very good. And I don't think that the Prime Minister thinks that his policy recommendations are any good. And I suggest that we don't attribute them any more weight than just a statement. He's not in the cabinet. I think he has proven a lot of times that his bark is much louder than his bite. He's been threatening and saying, I will dissolve the government and I will retire and I will do this and that. He hasn't. He's been saying all kinds of threats. Some of them have been pretty ridiculous. Some of them have been not ridiculous in my point of view. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't, that is not Israeli policy. And again, you can see on the ground what Israel did. What eventually the prime minister decided was, out of various options that are available to Israel, he chose the most tolerant and the least kinetic and the least escalatory step that was possible. And there are other steps that could have been taken that Israel didn't decide to do. And I think that there is a lot of willingness on the Israeli side, and probably on the other side of the aisle, other side of the hill as well, for this to work. And I think there's a lot of political capital that is really exposed here and on the line. I think President Trump really wants this to happen. I think Qatar and Turkey have a lot of interest in this happening because they are in for major gifts and donations and hardware and strategic capabilities from the US if everything goes well, and if President Trump sees that they have done the effort, the heavy lifting, applying pressure on Hamas to get the deal done. And I'll say that we did half a stage, very important, very strategic, very emotional, and a very meaningful day for Israelis when all of our live hostages were returned. But the deal is far from being implemented, and all of the parties still need to do a lot of work of goodwill in order for it to work. So I think, but just Jonathan, I think so. I think having aid to the region, especially after the 2 years of suffering and starvation that they've witnessed, I don't think it's justified by the delays in returning dead hostages. But at the same time, I do want to point out in the last few hours, they did open up the border for all aid trucks. So that changed. So I was initially, when I first organized this interview, I said, I want to speak to Jonathan. I was really upset when I saw that they halved aid trucks, but then that was lifted. So I was, it's heading in the right direction. Now, the point you've made is interesting. You said, according to Israeli intelligence and Qatari intelligence, Hamas actually has more dead hostages than they're making it out to be. So they have more than double-digit dead bodies of hostages. And they're intentionally, in your mind, they're intentionally delaying those bodies to delay phase one because they don't want to move to phase two, because phase two, I think, involves the beginning of disarmament and the establishment of the new technocratic government. So that's a fair argument. As you said, there is two sides to each coin. But there's another point that I want to get your feedback on, and that's the killings that happen on the Israeli side. So we've got on October 13th, a gentleman by the name of Khalid Barbak. He was inspecting his home in Khan Yunis, and he was struck, I think it was by a drone. The IDF has not given specific details on this strike. On October 14th, that was yesterday, an Israeli drone struck a residential neighborhood in Gaza City. Again, the IDF didn't explain that particular incident. They've got a general statement, which I'll read in a bit. Again, yesterday, a drone strike outside of Khan Yunis. And lastly, the one that's been publicized the most was 3 to 5 Palestinians were killed as they were approaching the yellow line. And Israel said, the IDF said, they fired at suspect who crossed the line and approached forces posing a threat. Aren't those clear violations of the ceasefire? Are you critical of these particular actions?
So I'm critical of the only incident that actually I'm aware of, and I may be at fault here, but the only incident that I'm aware of that I know the IDF was involved in was when there was a group of Palestinians who approached and threatened an Israeli position on the Israeli side of the yellow line, the line of withdrawal. They violated it, the Palestinians, they approached, and after the Israeli troops fired warning shots in order to cause them to disperse and to stop approaching, they didn't heed those warnings, and then they were attacked, struck, and eventually killed. Nothing benign, nothing civilian, nothing innocent about that event. It is standard practice by terrorists to dress as civilians, look as civilians, and make noises like civilians, and then start prodding and testing the boundaries of the situation. Sometimes they will use, and perhaps that is this case, sometimes they'll use some poor, unfortunate, gullible, and desperate Palestinian. They'll give him a few shekels, a few dollars, and say, go over there, you see, we want you to go and reach a certain point. I've seen that happen many times when I was in the field myself. I've arrested Palestinians, and when I interrogated them, why did you decide to come close to an Israeli position? You know that it's dangerous and that you may get shot, and it's a threat to us. And they said, well, I'm poor, I can't survive, I can't provide for my family, and this Hamas guy offered me, $5, and I need the money. That could be the case, but it's definitely not benign and not innocent. It's very cynical by Hamas. And ordinary Gazans, after 2 years of war, they know better than to approach and get close to an Israeli military position in a hot combat zone where there's just been a ceasefire declared. So I wouldn't be fooled. And again, I'll remind everybody watching, show me a video of that Hamas has released or visible on IDF media or on international media where Hamas is fighting in uniform. The only times I see Hamas is Adin al-Qassam and the military wing. The only time I see them in uniform is when they're returning hostages and feeling big and strong when they're manhandling Israeli hostages, or when they're doing military parades, and sometimes when they're executing Palestinians, they have the green headband and sometimes not. When they fight Israel, they are never in uniform. Never, ever have I seen them fight in uniform, and it would be nice if one of the viewers could show a video of it, because I haven't seen it. I've seen Hamas.
I think everyone agrees they do dress as civilians. I think it's common knowledge. And talking about Hamas dressing in uniform when they're executing Palestinians, I told you at the beginning of this, I'm critical of both sides. On the Hamas side, you've got different leaders talking about preparing for the continuation of the war, not wanting to disarm. Some statements saying they'll disarm to a new Palestinian government. But there doesn't seem to be the willingness you'd expect from a group that's been pummeled as they have over the last 2 years. And there's also been heartbreaking reports of Hamas getting civilians to kneel on the streets and shooting them in the head in front of a cheering crowd, which are pretty ugly scenes. Now, yeah, I haven't seen the video. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I haven't seen the video. Yeah, what does the video show? Did they just line them up and shoot them in the head? Did you see it?
Yeah, I've seen 2 angles of it, 2 different videos, and it's either 5 or 6 handcuffed, what appears to be Palestinians, most of them without shirts and blindfolded. They are manhandled, pushed down on their knees, a line of Hamas guys behind them. The Hamas guys, they clear the crowd in front of the direction of the bullets. They're, of course, very safety first, and they don't want bullets to hit any of the bystanders. So after they clear the bystanders that are in front of the bullets, they execute them by firing in the back of the head, and then another round in the head for good measure.
Now, they're calling these collaborators with Israel and calling them traitors. And we do know that there are clans, including the Abu Shabab clan, which has been reported as allied with Israel, has been funded by Israel. They've had clashes with Hamas. There's also, that's in Rafah. In Gaza City, there's the Dogmosh clan, which you mentioned earlier, also had clashes with Hamas. I think they were allied with Hamas at one stage. You've got in Khan Yunis, the Al-Mujahida clan, also had a dispute with Hamas. Can you first give us more context on these clashes? And doesn't that show an immediate need in Gaza for an international force to maintain the peace? Because there's just no infrastructure left, no security left whatsoever. And is Israel funding different clans, different groups to fight Hamas to this day?
So I'll start with the last part of the question. I think Israel is definitely involved in reaching out through its intelligence organizations and acting in order to undermine Hamas. Hamas is an enemy of Israel, and Israel is seeking to destabilize that enemy and weaken it and weaken its hold over Gaza. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is happening now and has been happening. Whether it's this or the other clan, I don't know, but it definitely makes sense. And going to the second question, yes, I agree. There's definitely an urgent need for the second phase to happen, or actually the third phase. Second phase is disarmament, and the third phase, as far as I remember, is for that international force or body to be formed and deployed. But let's not let's not deceive ourselves here. If we look at other conflicts, other wars, usually what happens when there's a ceasefire or when there's some kind of decision of a war, when one side surrenders or when there's a ceasefire, if there's a surrender, then the winning side occupies the area, and there's usually a transition period. That happened in that's usually what happens. The winning side takes control and transitions into something else. And the first stage, exactly in order to prevent chaos and anarchy and jungle laws on the streets of wherever, is that you apply martial law and you keep everybody on a very tight leash. That is not what's happening. And Hamas here is playing a pretty clever game because they want to reestablish their dominance, and they want to settle scores with anybody that they perceive is disloyal or a threat. And they also know, as I said before, that it has to happen. It's a succession. First phase 1, then 2, then 3, and the things cannot happen before the previous phase has been completed successfully. And that is one of the reasons why they are delaying the delivery of the bodies, because they want more time to stifle dissent, to reestablish their dominance, and to terrorize the other clans and the other people who may have had creative ideas in Gaza into submission. So that's how the things are connected. It's not it's not by chance and coincidence that Hamas has been doing one thing, delaying, and immediately out on the streets, and also very importantly in their messaging. If you look at the messaging in Arabic by the Ministry of the Interior to Gazans, they're saying, we're giving you one warning, and if you don't surrender now and come forward, and maybe then we'll spare your life, otherwise we're going to execute you. And then they show movies of executions. The purpose here is to terrorize and to regain control over the Gaza Strip. So yes, there is urgency for this to happen. And frankly, if you are concerned, I am very concerned that things aren't happening fast enough, and that I don't see enough clarity in how is this going to happen. I know that Israel doesn't want to be the police force of the day after, but I also cannot see really who is going to be that police force. I know that the Egyptians, cynical and quite masterfully as they usually are, they have been preparing a police force of the Palestinian Authority. They've been training about 10,000 police officers in Egypt, and I assume that once the political conditions are favorable, they will present them. There's a good chance that there won't be other takers, that the Qataris, the Turks,
Turkey? You don't think Turkey would have a force that will go? I think they've already sent an aid members to the region today. You don't think Turkey would send peacekeeping forces?
I don't think anybody will send anything that would be a threat to Hamas as long as Hamas has weapons. Because when push comes to shove, Hamas, I don't think they will let go of their weapons, and I think that they will be threatened by anybody that seeks to take control over the Gaza Strip, as the agreement says, even if it is Turks, even if it is Qataris. I don't think that the Qataris have soldiers to send, and I don't think that the Qatari soldiers would be of much use on the ground. The Turkish soldiers have combat experience, and that's a solid military. And if they would be sent, then that could be a serious thing. But I struggle to see that happen.
Do you think Israel's going to be pulling out of Gaza to the territory that was agreed upon? Which is, I think they remain in a buffer zone of about 15% of Gaza, from what I remember. Do you think that will happen?
If stage 4 is reached, if Hamas implements the other parts, yes.
And do you think Hamas will? And the main point there is Hamas disarmament. I think this is the biggest sticking point, correct?
I agree. Hamas disarmament is the real bottleneck for this entire deal. That's the deal maker and the deal breaker. If Hamas isn't forced to disarm, no deal. And sooner rather than later, unfortunately, I think the chances of us finding ourselves fighting again are pretty significant.
If Hamas disarms, why wouldn't Israel pull out of the entire territory? Why keep 15%?
No, I think eventually Israel would. But I was actually along the Gaza border today, and I had a look at the region. And what Israel has done, and I think that's a pretty rational, reasonable thing to do, is to create a buffer zone, a no-go zone, where nobody is allowed within a certain distance, at least half a kilometer from the border. And that's in order to make it very difficult for any such attack like October 7 to ever be repeated. What the reality that existed before October 7 was that Hamas encroached on the border area by, again, looking like civilians, by sending civilian farmers ahead, by having innocent-looking women with a cart and a donkey, and with kids going forward, and all kinds of tricks and regular guerrilla manipulations. And they basically minimize the distance between where it's normal for Palestinians to be on the other side and the proximity to the fence. And then on October 7, they used that, and they used it very successfully. So what Israel wants to do now is to create a no-go zone, and that nobody goes in there. Not a farmer, not a woman, or someone that is dressed to look like a woman, no kids playing soccer, nothing goes into that area, because that needs to be totally clear and void of any activity for defensive purposes. And if you ask me how it will look at the end of the day, I don't think that Israeli troops will be deployed on the other side of the border. I think that wouldn't be tactically wise. I think that eventually, if all of the stages are implemented, Hamas is disarmed, the international body of the peacekeeping force comes in, and Gaza starts to transition, I think it's pretty reasonable to assess that the Israeli troops would withdraw to the Israeli side of the border and then actively patrol, monitor, and control that area with fire in order to prevent anybody from going in, but without actually being in there.
And what happens if Hamas does not disarm? Again, I can get you some quotes here. You've got Osama Hamdan said that Hamas will not hand over its weapons before the liberation and establishment of the state. And I think he's referring, at least from the people interpreting it, he's referring to the Palestinian state without Israel. You got Khalil al-Haya saying that a countdown to renewed attacks has begun. That was 2 days ago. Doesn't sound that optimistic. You've got Mohammad Nizal, who's another Hamas leader. He accused Israel of stalling and manipulating the agreement. He said that Hamas is prepared for any treachery from Israel, prepared for war. And lastly, you've got Bassem Naim. He did an interview with Sky News, and he said that Hamas would only hand over weapons to the hands of a Palestinian state. I think this is the best statement out of the four. And if Hamas does not hand over their weapons, then what? Or not even Hamas. Let's say the commanders ask the soldiers to hand over their weapons. Some of them are they just hate Israel too much, or they've had their loved one killed, and they want to hold on to their weapons and seek revenge. Does that immediately mean the peace deal is over? And what will be the repercussions?
Or seek revenge or continue jihad? I think it's much more about continuing jihad against the Jews than.
But if it's not Hamas, but if it's not Hamas as an organization, because obviously their control is not the same as it was 2 years ago. So if you've just got some members, or maybe some of them form another clan and they want to fight Israel, because it's hard to completely, the agreement, the peace plan include de-radicalization. We talked about it last time. It's just really difficult to achieve that. I hope they succeed, or Israel succeeds, or the world succeeds. But if it doesn't, and you've got this radicalized groups that will continue trying to seek revenge or jihad or whatever, but not Hamas specifically, what happens then? What would Israel do then? Would we see a continuation of the war? Or could we see a bit of patience from Israel for the international peacekeeping force to try to establish law and order? Because I just worry that we'll continue seeing strikes as we've seen in Lebanon. Justified or not, we've debated it. I'm less critical about Lebanon versus Israel versus Gaza. Or in Syria, seeing continuation of the strikes. What do you expect in Gaza?
Yeah, the situation in Lebanon is different, because in Lebanon, the deal is different, and the ceasefire agreement actually stipulates that Israel is entitled to do what it is doing now. What Israel is doing now is within the bounds of the agreement with the Americans and the French and the Lebanese government, where it says very clearly, Hezbollah shall not repurpose any of its infrastructure in southern Lebanon and or any of its strategic infrastructure. And if they try to do that, then they may be warned, or Israel may be allowed to take direct action. And in some cases, they've been warned. Most of the times they didn't listen. And in some cases, Israel has taken direct action, and I think it will continue to do so. That is not the case in Gaza. That is not the agreement, as far as I understand it. And sadly, I say regretfully, Israel doesn't appear to have that level of freedom of action to operate when it comes to Gaza, and the details of the deal are different. Now, you mentioned, patience or tolerance or something to that effect about, the international peacekeeping force doing its job. Listen, I've liaised with UN peacekeeping for 7 years, and I even served at the UN headquarters in UN peacekeeping on behalf of Israel. And even though this isn't a UN force, so it's inherently something that should be much better and much more purposeful than a UN peacekeeping force, but the common denominator here is that no country wants to send its soldiers to a peacekeeping force far away from its borders and have them return in caskets. No country has any interest in doing that. So I would love for there to be a powerful, effective, deterring peace enforcement, which is actually what I think we're looking for, not peacekeeping. Peace enforcement is one level above peacekeeping. A peace enforcement force that would actually be able to, stare down Hamas and say, lay down your weapons, that's the deal, and we're here to make sure that the deal is implemented. Does such a thing exist? Do I see the political will or the capacity to organize one and to sustain casualties? No, I don't. So I would prefer for that to happen, because it would save Israel from having to do it. And I think an Israeli government would say, well, okay, let's give it a go. If there's an international force that is willing and capable, equipped, and has the political support and the military capacity to do so, great. The moment that it will stand up, I will applaud and support it, if it is indeed something that turns into reality.
I'm just looking at the agreement with Hezbollah, and it is accurate. These commitments do not preclude either Israel or Lebanon from exercising their inherent right for self-defense, consistent with international law. I think the agreement offers some ambiguity if Hezbollah continues to operate in that southern region, correct? And that's what gives Israel justification for striking.
Yeah, there's also a side letter which hasn't been published, but there's a side letter between the US and Israel that the French are also aware of, which kind of stipulates the more important things about Israeli activity against Hezbollah. And that's why you haven't heard the US government, or you haven't even heard the French complain about what Israel is doing, because that is what was agreed upon before.
What about Syria?
Syria, I mean, if you take a look at that border, if you look at it from an Israeli perspective, then you have Israeli communities on the border with kind of a similar defense system that Israel had on the Gaza border, a fence, few obstacles, barbed wire, camera, sensors, etc., and a few troops. But essentially, on the other side of the border, you have a potential jihadi army. When the Syrian government forces were mobilizing and attacking the Druze community in Sweda, then that looked very similar to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra. Guys on pickup trucks that were shooting to kill no matter who or what, and it was pretty brutal. From an Israeli perspective, there is absolutely no willingness and tolerance to allow any such threat to materialize in any proximity to the border. And the whole Israeli policy is, if a totally demilitarized zone where there's no military threats within many tens of kilometers from the Israeli border is established, then Israel will withdraw, and I think also adjust its fire or engagement policy. To be fair, I don't remember Israel striking anything very significantly in Syria over the last month and a half. By the way, an interesting piece of intel, which I think is relevant when you mention Syria, and it connects with Gaza, is that there are a few Israeli intel sources that indicate that Hamas is trying to establish a foothold in Daraa, in southern Syria, southwestern Syria, close to the Jordanian border.
Hamas?
Yes.
How is Hamas able to have presence anywhere outside of Gaza, which they barely have presence in Gaza in the first place? Or is Hamas becoming more, rather than an organization, more of an ideology and movement now, kind of similar to ISIS, where ISIS just has all these different groups that call themselves ISIS or ISIS affiliate. So people that want to support the Palestinian cause in a violent way start to link themselves to Hamas somehow, as we saw many years ago.
So Hamas is active and strong in Lebanon, southern Lebanon. Basically, most of the so-called refugee camps, the UNRWA-administered refugee camps in Lebanon, there's about 550,000 recognized refugees by UNRWA, Palestinians in Gaza, in Lebanon. That's fertile recruiting ground for Hamas, and it has been so for years. And if you go to Ain el-Hilwa and a lot of other places in southern Lebanon, you will find active Hamas units with commanders and chains of command, and with logistics and weapons, etc.
They've started disarming those, the Lebanese government, haven't they? They've disarmed a couple of camps already.
Yeah, there have been media days and photo ops, etc. And perhaps some weapons indeed were at least handed over once.
You got to be more optimistic, Jonathan. I thought we'd be optimistic at least about Lebanon. It's heading in the right direction, no?
No, there are good things being done. I agree with you with that. There are positive things being done in Lebanon. I think things that could be really good for the Lebanese state, that they can control their own territory, not have armed factions with foreign interests in their midst, whether it's Iranian interest or Palestinian interest or Syrian interest or, for that matter, Israeli interest. Not that there are any. But I think it would be good and a welcome development. But, this isn't my first rodeo. I've seen, ceremonies like this where weapons are taken, and then when the cameras go away, they're also returned. I don't know exactly what has happened, but I really hope that the Lebanese state actually implements the deal, and I hope that the U.S. will help them. The U.S. and the French will actually help them do it and make sure that it really happens. But you spoke of Syria, Hamas. It's an interesting move, and it makes sense because Hamas is, as you say very correctly, significantly weakened in Gaza. And I think that they've been weakened in Lebanon as well. It makes sense for them to try to migrate to another area and try to establish infrastructure. And when you look at the social fabric of people in Daraa, it's a pretty good match. It's Sunnis. It's very poor, disenfranchised Sunnis that probably would be more or less okay with Hamas introducing itself there. So I wouldn't write it off. I'm watching it, and other people are watching it as well. And for that reason and many other reasons, Israel is very, very vigilant when it comes to Syria. That's the bottom line that I'm trying to get at, that after October 7, Israel is not going to take chances with having, jihadi armies deployed along its borders. If there is no threats at all, then Israel will be able to stand down and be a little bit less offensive or vigilant. But at the end of the day, when you look at southwestern Syria, it's pretty messy. It's pretty dynamic, and there's lots of power struggles and lots of armed guys on pickup trucks that are driving around with a vengeance. And Israel has no intention for that to spill over into Israel and to threaten Israeli civilians.
The state of Syria over the last decade or two is just heartbreaking. The state of Syria today. Last question for you, John, is you're generally well measured with your responses and your ideologies, at least from the discussions we've had. I've been listening to you for a long time. What's your position on members of the cabinet, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and others, and some of the statements they make? Genocidal statements. I'm sure you agree that there's some genocidal statements they've made in the last few years. Where do you stand on those? Because these are not just your average Israelis, same way you've got your average members of any community or any country that are on one extreme or the other. These are members of the cabinet. Does that concern you? And I'm not sure what your stance is on these things. I've never asked for your personal opinion. Do you believe in a two-state solution? Maybe that's the first question to get your position. And then would love your thoughts on these statements.
At this stage, I'll be very blunt. I don't think that the two-state solution is viable, relevant, or interesting for any of the two sides. Not the Palestinians and not the Israelis. I think the Israelis have become disillusioned with the two-state solution after 32 years of the Oslo Agreement, which started well with lots of high hopes, with a lot of optimism in Israel, including my optimism. But when you take stock of the Oslo Accords, it has not delivered. It has not delivered safety and security to Israelis. There are more Israelis killed by Palestinian terrorists after the Oslo Accords than before the Oslo Accords by a big margin. And it has not delivered Palestinian statehood. It created a corrupt and useless Palestinian authority that, instead of building institutions, promoting coexistence, and really building the future for Palestinian people, they've been busy lining their pockets with money from abroad and nepotism and corruption. They haven't been very useful to the Palestinians or to solving the conflict.
What's the alternative, though?
And on the Israeli side, I think Israelis have, after October 7, many are listening to what Arabs are saying. And when forget his name, was it Hamdan or Khalil al-Khaya, one of them, when he said we're going to do October 7 again and again and again until we succeed and until we defeat the occupation. And then the female Lebanese interviewer asks, are you talking about Gaza? And says, no, all of it, all of Palestine. So Israelis listen to that. So I think Israelis want peace. I want peace. I would want to live.
How? Sorry to ask you again, but how can you do it without a two-state solution? We're both human, and we know that one of our not fundamental right, but a need is to have freedom. And for freedom, you have to have the right for self-defense. You have to have the right of transport, being able to import. West Bank hasn't had that. Gaza hasn't had that. What is the alternative?
So I think for that to happen, and I agree with you, self-definition, independence, freedom, dignity, respect, very important things for everybody. I know that my people fought many, many decades and centuries in order to have that. Now we have our country. And I can understand someone else who wants to have it as well. What I cannot agree and tolerate is them not agreeing with the fact that we are here, and them, instead of building their own future, trying to ruin ours. And that's basically what's going on in Gaza, and to a certain extent what has been going on in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank under the PA. They could have had a country a long time ago, and they could have had a pretty flourishing country a long time ago if they had channeled the trillions of dollars that the world has been pouring on this people, the Palestinians. If they would have focused on building alongside Israel, they would have had a country a long time ago. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, a week and a half ago, he showed a map. He made it public now. He showed a map that he offered Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the chairman of the PA. He offered him 98% of the territory, a capital in eastern Jerusalem, land swaps to accommodate the future of a Palestinian state. And Mahmoud Abbas said no, because it wasn't enough. Why? Because he was required to sign and say, I, on behalf of the Palestinian people, have no more claims and I end the conflict. And he wasn't willing. And he got the best offer that any Palestinian ever got in history and will ever get in the future. There's never going to be, in my mind, such a generous and, in my mind, reckless offer by an Israeli prime minister. But it was given and he said no. So, they have themselves to blame for being obstructionist and refusal.
And then, but again, the tough question is, what's the alternative?
The alternative is, well, there are a few alternatives. I think it's within Israel's interest to seek to end to minimize friction and contact between Israelis and Arabs in the land of Israel. And I think that the longer time that goes by does not serve Israeli purposes. And I think that the situation of ambiguity and lack of clarity, lack of established borders, does not serve any of the sides. And I care about my side. And therefore, I think that it should be managed different politically. One of the ironic things is that Israeli security forces are very, very good at undermining Palestinian terror in Judea and Samaria. And it's keeping the events at a tolerable level of violence. That allows Israeli decision makers to have less urgency and not make the tough decisions that are needed in order to do what's good for Israel and also what would be beneficial for Palestinians. But Israeli leaders' responsibility is to do what's good for Israel. And we've had, in my mind, too many years of indecision where Israel hasn't really made clear what it wants to do. There's no real clear policy of how does the state of Israel see Judea and Samaria. I think there's an overwhelming popular majority that feel in their guts and in their sentiment and their feelings and their religious beliefs that is Israel. And then there are people who believe that it isn't because Arabs live there. There are people who believe that that should be the future Palestinian state. And then there's people who say, well, we can't allow them to have the high terrain which dominates the modern state of Israel, and we can't allow them to be our eastern border with Jordan, Iraq, and Iran. There's a lot of complexities here, and I don't have an alternative answer to tell you, well, no two-state. I'll say that there's an interesting initiative in Hebron.
But there isn't a middle ground. It's either a two-state solution. Long term, it either has to be a two-state solution or a one-state solution. Would you lean more to a one-state solution? And if so, what happens to all the Palestinians?
No, I wouldn't like a one-state solution, because I would want my country to remain a democracy and one with an inherent long-term Jewish majority. And the two things aren't compatible. If we continue to have this unclear situation when it comes to Judea and Samaria. With Gaza, there's clarity. Gaza is not Israel, and there are ideas and aspirations, and people have feelings and ideas and dreams. Okay, fine, I can respect and understand, but factually, it is beyond the 1949 armistice line, and I think that the state of Israel has shown since 2005 that it is not interested in the Gaza Strip. Regarding Judea and Samaria, that is much more complex, and here we go back to the historical roots of the people of Israel. You go through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, it is all there. It is about Jerusalem and Hebron and Shechem, the biblical Nablus, and all of the other places. That is where really the Jewish nation was born. So to tell people that isn't your homeland, because currently 3,000 years after you lived there for the first time, now there are other people who live there and they don't like you, that's an issue.
What happens to the Palestinians there, the West Bank?
So I think that one of my major frustrations with the current political situation is that I think that the international community, led by Europe and Arab states, and to a certain extent the US State Department, not necessarily presidents, but the US State Departments, they've kind of fallen in love and canonized the two-state solution as if that is the only option to end or to disentangle the conflict between us and the Arabs. And I say, okay, that may have been true 40 or 50 years ago. We tried the two-state solution. Oslo was an attempt at bringing about the two-state solution. But if we're honest, Oslo has not been successful. I would have wanted Oslo to be successful. I hoped for it. I was a young and perhaps naive man at the time. And many people thought that, yeah, the wings of peace are flapping, and we're now going to see a different era, and we're going to solve the conflict with the Arabs. That wasn't in the cards because they said no. The Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, both of them rejected legitimate Israeli offers on maps made by the Israeli prime ministers with American mediation at Camp David and afterwards at the White Plantation, where Israel said, okay, let's end the conflict. We will make real concessions here, things that we'll cut in the meat of things that are real hurtful for us, things that we believe is our entitlement. But you know what? We will let it go and let's finish the conflict. And the response has been a continuous, persistent no by the Palestinians. And there's a certain limit, I think there should be a certain limit to how many times the Palestinians can say no and still get another seat at the negotiations table.
Yeah, I just think that the West Bank is very different to what Hamas has done in Gaza. And as you can see by the question and how long we've discussed it, it's difficult to imagine any other option. I understand why a lot of Israelis don't want a two-state solution, especially after October 7th. Also understand, I'm sure you understand why Palestinians as humans want their own state. But I just don't see any other path that doesn't involve ethnic cleansing. That's what worries me. Maybe some sort of path.
Ethnic cleansing is not in the cards. Ethnic cleansing is not in the cards, and I don't think a violent solution is either. I would encourage leaders to be more creative and a bit more humble. Americans and Europeans, I think, should be more humble when they approach this conflict and not continue to not beat the dead horse, but force a solution that hasn't worked and hasn't delivered. And they should actually listen to Palestinians, to Arabs, and to Israelis. And the Palestinians, the Arabs are saying it very clearly. We don't want it. We want a one-state solution. The Jews don't belong here. And the Israelis are saying, well, we tried this two-state business, but they keep on saying no, the Palestinians. And after October 7, we're not so keen anymore.
But the Palestinian Authority wasn't part of October 7th. The Palestinian Authority has not committed any major crimes against Israel for a pretty long time now.
Other than the fact that they are funding terrorists and paying them monthly salaries.
If they change that, I think there's discussions about revoking that law. If that law is revoked, where they're not funding terrorists, I know they're corrupt, but there's many countries right now that have sovereignty that are corrupt. Now, sure, we can both list a whole bunch of them. If they are corrupt, that wouldn't be enough of a reason not to give them their own country. I'm talking about the West Bank, because October 7th is linked to Hamas in Gaza.
Yeah, but it's about an agreement to end the conflict. Because if they get the country and then, it's a country that will be at war with Israel, then what will we have achieved? It needs to be, okay, you get statehood, you get independence, autonomy, you get this and that. And in return, you say, we are done. We have ended the conflict with the Jews, and we recognize
if they say that.
If
they say that now, do you think they'd recognize you think they should deserve their own country, or you think that in your mind, I want to get your truth. Do you think that ship has sailed after October 7th and the last few years, especially October 7th?
I think it's possible in the future, not now, because Israelis are very, very skeptical of anything coming from Arab mouths now, especially this chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. And but I'm hopeful about the future. Eventually, I think it will happen and will change. But currently, I think the levels of cynicism are too high. I'm sorry to end on a negative note.
Yeah, not at all. No, I wanted to ask you. I know we went way over time. I want to ask you one last question: is where were you on October 7th? I want to get your thoughts on that day when you saw the news reporting as the attack was unfolding. I'm not sure if anyone's asked you that question. I haven't.
I was at home in my pajamas. Saturday morning, 6:30 a.m. I had no indication what was going to happen. Released from, finished my military service with my family, and just as surprised as every Israeli to hear alarms blaring in central Israel. We live in central Israel, and it's not a place that usually is targeted by rockets. And very surprised. My first fear was Hezbollah from Lebanon is attacking. And when I saw 15 minutes later, approximately, a video of one of those Nukhba squads in a white pickup truck in Sderot, Israeli city close to the Gaza border, I told my wife, okay, this means war. I got to go find my uniform because I'm going to be needed as a spokesperson. I had a short dilemma what to do, whether to go down south and fight or to fight in the media, in words. What eventually decided that was the fact that I didn't have a weapon at home. So I thought it would have been pretty reckless to drive south without a weapon into a combat zone. And instead, I started talking, and I've been kind of talking since.
Jonathan, absolute pleasure as always. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mario. A pleasure.
Bye-bye, sir.
Bye-bye.